There's a moment, and I think anyone who's ever stood at the edge of something enormous knows exactly what I'm talking about, where you realize the world you thought you understood is maybe a tenth of what it actually is. Maybe less. I had that moment on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not one of those days where you wake up and something in the air smells different, where the light through the window feels heavier than usual. Just a regular Tuesday in late October, and I was sitting in the orbital observation deck of Way Station Meridian with a cup of something that was technically coffee, but tasted more like warm, brown regret, watching the Velith diplomatic convoy drift past the viewport. 17 ships. I counted them because I had nothing better to do, and because counting things is what my brain does when it's trying not to panic. 17 ships, each one roughly the size of a mid-sized Earth city, sleek and curved and absolutely dripping with that particular Velith design philosophy that basically screams. We have been doing this for 40,000 years, and we are very good at it. They were heading toward the conclave. The galactic conclave, the big one. The one humanity had been invited to attend for the first time in our 42 years of registered membership in the greater galactic community. Invited, not welcomed. There's a difference, and believe me, we understood it. My name is Dara Vasquez-Min. I was 29 years old at the time, and I worked as a junior liaison interpreter for the Earth Diplomatic Corps, which sounds impressive until you understand that my actual job was to sit in the back of rooms and make sure that when an alien dignitary said something dismissive about humanity, I translated it accurately and without crying. I was good at my job. Mostly. The thing about the greater galactic community that they don't tell you in school, or they do tell you, but in that careful, diplomatic way that strips all the emotional truth out of it, is that humanity is a joke. Not a mean joke, exactly, not the kind where someone is trying to hurt your feelings. More like the kind of joke that arises naturally when you put something very small and very young next to something very large and very ancient, and the contrast itself becomes funny. We'd been out there 42 years. 42 years since first contact with the Dravari, since the galactic registry scan confirmed we were a Type 1.8 civilization on the Kessler scale, since the paperwork was filed and stamped, and humanity officially became a recognized species. 42 years. The Velith had been spacefaring for 40,000. The Dominari Collective had member civilizations that remembered the last galactic dark age, a period humanity hadn't even been primates for. The Sanathi, our closest galactic neighbors geographically, had a word in their language that translated roughly to the awkward phase, and they used it exclusively to describe civilizations that were less than 100,000 years old. They didn't say it mean. They said it the way you'd describe a puppy that keeps falling over its own feet. Affectionate, dismissive, both. And Earth had sent us to the conclave. Earth had sent a delegation of 11 diplomats and their support staff, 31 people total, to sit in a room with representatives from 67 civilizations, some of whom had histories so long that our entire run of recorded human culture barely registered as a footnote. We were going to talk about galactic security concerns, specifically the thing in the Vethara expanse. I should explain the Vethara expanse because it matters. The expanse is a region of space roughly 400 light-years across, sitting at what the galactic charts call the outer rim, but which most spacefaring species just call the edge of where anybody bothered to map carefully. It had been showing anomalous readings for about 16 years, deep space telescopes picking up energy signatures that didn't match any known natural phenomenon, gravitational fluctuations that weren't attaching themselves to any visible mass, that kind of thing. The Dominari Collective had sent 3 survey missions. 2 came back with data. Interesting data, unsettling data, but data. 1 didn't come back at all. And then about 8 months before the conclave, a Sanathi cargo freighter on a routine long-haul run through the outer lanes disappeared. Completely. No distress signal, no wreckage, no trace. Then a Velith science station at the Expanse's border went dark. 63 personnel just gone. That was when the conclave was called. Emergency session, extraordinary circumstances, all registered species to send representatives. All of them, including us. Ambassador Karen Okafer was the head of our delegation. I want to tell you about him because he matters to this story in a way, I didn't fully understand until later. Karen was 57, Nigerian-Irish, had spent 20 years in Earth's actual military before transitioning to diplomatic service, and possessed the specific kind of calm that you only develop by being in rooms where things have gone very badly and surviving them anyway. He was the kind of man who walked into spaces slowly, not because he was lazy, but because he was reading them. Every room he entered, he'd do this thing, just a slight pause at the threshold, eyes moving, processing. I used to think it was a habit. Later, I understood it was training. He had a reputation in the diplomatic corps for saying very little during negotiations, and then, when he did speak, saying the one thing nobody else had thought to say. The Velith delegates, when they met us at Way Station Meridian for the preliminary sessions before the main conclave, were polite. The Velith are always polite. They're about 2 meters tall, trilaterally symmetrical, with a kind of bioluminescent skin pattern that shifts with their emotional state, which makes it very hard for them to lie, incidentally, and very easy to accidentally betray how they feel about the people they're talking to. When they saw our delegation, their skin patterns did this thing. I caught it. My job was to catch things like that. The pattern was called Sethara, roughly bemused patience. The kind of expression you make when a child says something unexpectedly sophisticated, and you're trying to decide whether to be impressed or just wait for them to contradict themselves. Ambassador Okafor noticed. I know he did because his jaw tightened by about 3 millimeters and then relaxed again. That was it. That was his entire reaction. He extended his hand to the Velith lead delegate, who had 3 of them and wasn't quite sure which one to offer back. Ambassador Thesivar, Okafor said, thank you for the welcome. The community is complete, Thesivar replied, in the formal phrasing that meant everyone who should be here is here, but which every human interpreter understood also carried the subtext, even the ones we weren't sure about. Okafor smiled like he hadn't heard the subtext. I wrote it down anyway. The transit to the conclave itself took 3 days on a Velith diplomatic carrier. They'd offered us berths, which was generous, and the quarters were clearly designed for Velith physiology but had been modified for human use in a way that was thoughtful in execution but slightly off in every dimension. The beds were a little too wide. The ceilings a little too high. The light spectrum adjusted to approximate Earth normal, which it almost managed. It was like sleeping in a very expensive hotel room that had been described to the designer over a phone call with bad reception. I spent most of the transit in the forward observation lounge, watching space, which I know sounds romantic and cinematic, but was actually mostly just me trying to process the fact that I was here at all. On the second day, I was joined by a Dominari representative named Vessel of Considered Opinion, which was their actual name, or at least the closest translation we had. The Dominari are, imagine something like a colonial organism crossed with a distributed intelligence. Each individual is actually a coordinated collective of around 40,000 smaller units, presented to the outside world through a single constructed body that functioned as an interface. Vessel of Considered Opinion presented as roughly bipedal, about my height, with a surface texture like dark water constantly in slow motion. They sat next to me, or near me, proximate to me. You are nervous, they said. It wasn't really a question. The Dominari are very good at reading biological stress indicators. Yes, I said. You should not be, they said. The conclave will not ask much of humanity. Your role is largely observational. I looked at them. What do you mean? The matter of the expanse will be addressed by the major security powers, the Velith, the Sanathi, the Collective, perhaps the Ardori if they choose to engage. Vessel of Considered Opinion's surface rippled slightly, the way it did when they were selecting words. Humanity will listen. Humanity will learn. This is appropriate for your stage. I wanted to say something. I had a whole sentence forming, something about how maybe humanity had more to contribute than they expected, something diplomatic and confident. What I actually said was, right. Vessel of Considered Opinion nodded, which they'd learned from us, and went back to their contemplation. I stared out at the stars. Your stage. Like we were children who'd been allowed to come along on the grown-up trip. The conclave station was called the Gathering Point, which is the kind of name that loses all its grandiosity in translation, but which in the original Velith carried about 6 layers of ceremonial weight. It was a neutral installation, built jointly by the 7 oldest civilizations in the community, situated at a gravitational equilibrium point between 3 star systems. It was the size of a small moon. I'm not exaggerating. I checked the specs later. The station's outer diameter was 1,100 kilometers. It had been expanding slowly for about 12,000 years. There were sections of it that nobody had been into in recorded galactic history because the species who built them had since gone extinct or transcended or simply moved on, and the rooms just sat there, sealed, waiting. When our shuttle docked at the human-allocated port, a cluster of bays on the outer ring that had been specifically expanded to accommodate our ships, I had to stop myself from pressing my face against the viewport window like a kid. I pressed my face against the viewport window. Nobody saw, or everyone saw and was too polite to say anything. The conclave hall itself was an interior space roughly 3 kilometers in diameter, with tiered assembly galleries arranged around a central speaking floor. Each species had a gallery. Ours was on the 3rd tier, which our advanced team had described in the briefing materials as a position of respectful inclusion. What it actually was the back corner. I took my seat behind the main delegation, arranged my translation equipment, tested my earpiece, and looked out across the hall. 67 species. I want you to sit with that number for a second. 67 different evolutionary paths, 67 different ways of becoming intelligent, and then becoming spacefaring, and then becoming this. Representatives from civilizations that had seen stars born and die. Ambassadors from species that had colonies on 100 worlds, 1,000 worlds. Delegates who looked back at history the way you or I might look at old photographs, with a comfortable distance, with the ability to say that was a difficult time, but we got through it. And there we were, 11 humans and their support staff. 1 species, 1 home planet, plus some orbital installations and a Mars colony of 40,000, 42 years of membership. The Velith delegate opened the conclave. They're very good at opening ceremonies. There's a kind of formal authority they carry that even the most ancient civilizations seem to accept, partly because the Velith have basically been running galactic logistics for so long that almost everyone owes them something. Thesavar spoke for about 20 minutes, and I translated the highlights for the delegation, skipping the ritual portions because we'd been briefed on those and, frankly, they were mostly extremely formal throat-clearing. The substance when it came, 3 more incidents in the Vethara expanse, a Sanathi patrol vessel, a Dominari survey collective, 400 member units, irreplaceable, an automated Ardori relay station that had simply stopped transmitting mid-broadcast. Something was out there. Something that didn't announce itself, didn't make demands, didn't communicate. It just removed things. The silence that followed that summary was the particular kind of silence that exists when a large group of very different entities all experience the same emotion simultaneously. In this case, fear. Not panic, not yet, but that careful, deliberate fear of something genuinely unknown. Then the Sanathi representatives stood to speak. The Sanathi are, let me describe them carefully, because they matter to what comes next. They're roughly the size of a large horse, 6-limbed, with a bilateral division between the front 4 limbs, which handle fine manipulation, and the rear 2, which handle locomotion. Their heads are slightly too large for their bodies in a way that suggests their brains are doing a lot of work. They've been spacefaring for about 30,000 years, and during that time have developed a reputation as the galaxy's best military tacticians. Their military advisor to the conclave was a being called Sethkorath the Elder, which in Sanathi naming conventions indicated someone who had not merely lived a long time, but had accumulated weight, experience, and consequence both. Sethkorath laid out the Sanathi proposal with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. The expanse needed to be secured. This required a joint military operation from the major security powers. The Sanathi would contribute 40 warships, including 6 of their capital-class vessels. The Velith Armada would contribute 32 ships. The Dominari Collective would deploy their war collectives, roughly equivalent to 20 conventional warships in combat capacity. The Ardori would contribute specialized shielding technology and support craft. Total, a fleet of considerable power, the largest joint military deployment in about 800 years. And it would be, Sethkorath said, and here they paused, and their pause had a specific texture to it, sufficient. With respect to all registered members present, they continued, the security operation should be conducted by those with the appropriate capability and experience. Observer status is available to all delegations wishing to monitor the operation's progress. Observer status. There it was. I translated it for the delegation. I felt Ambassador Ockhaffer's attention sharpen behind me, not a visible thing, just something I'd learned to sense after 18 months working for him, like a slight change in the air. Several other delegations responded. The Ardori confirmed their contribution. The Velith formalized their numbers. The Dominari Collective spoke in their particular layered voice, way that always gave human translators headaches, because they literally spoke in harmonics, multiple meanings simultaneously, and you had to pick which layer you were translating. A few smaller civilizations offered support roles, medical ships, supply lines, the things that weren't combat but were necessary for combat. And then Thesivar, following protocol, opened the floor to any additional contributions. Standard practice, polite gesture, the conclave equivalent of asking the room if anyone had questions. Ambassador Ockhaffer stood up. Now I need to stop and tell you something about the weight of that moment, because in retrospect it changed everything, and at the time it just looked like a man standing up in a conference room. The conclave hall had good acoustics. When Ockhaffer stood, it triggered the translation broadcast. His voice would go out through every species' audio system in their preferred language format simultaneously. Every single delegate in that hall would hear him. A human speaking at the conclave. There was a ripple, an actual ripple of reaction across the galleries. I saw it. I'm sure everyone in our delegation saw it. 67 species, and maybe half of them shifted in their various ways, the equivalent of turning to look at who was speaking. Seth Korath's expression didn't change, but one of their rear limbs shifted in a way that, in Sanathi body language, meant unexpected. Thesivar's skin pattern flickered, just briefly. Sethara again bemused patience, but now with something underneath it. Curiosity, perhaps, or the particular polite wariness of someone trying to determine if they should be concerned. Ambassador Ockhaffer, Thesivar said, acknowledging him with the formal address. You have the floor. Ockhaffer looked out across the hall. He took his time. That pause at the threshold, except now the threshold was 67 civilizations. Thank you, Chair Thesivar, he said. His voice was even, not loud. He'd learned early in his diplomatic career that raising your voice in a large room just makes you sound like you're compensating for something. I'll be brief. Brief, in a hall where Seth Korath had spoken for 40 minutes. I've heard the proposed joint operation, and I want to offer Earth support. Support, the hall was very still. Earth does not have the fleet capacity to contribute meaningfully to the main tactical force, he continued. We're aware of that, and we don't pretend otherwise. A pause. But we have something we'd like the conclave to be aware of. Thesivar's skin rippled slightly. Please continue. Ockhaffer said 3 words. The verdant horizon. And then he sat back down. 42 years of human spaceflight. That's the number everyone always led with when discussing humanity's place in the galaxy. 42 years. A blink. An eye blink, cosmically speaking. The Velith had been doing this for 1,000 times longer. What could humanity have possibly developed in 42 years that was worth mentioning to this room? It's a reasonable question. Here's the thing about humanity. The thing that I think even we didn't fully understand about ourselves until much later. Until events like this one forced us to look at it clearly. We are, as a species, constitutionally incapable of believing a problem is too large to solve. It's a flaw, maybe. It's gotten us into trouble more times than I can count. But it's also the thing that meant that when we looked up at the Milky Way and counted 200 billion stars and said we want to go there, we didn't say it like a dream. We said it like a plan. 42 years of spaceflight, that's the public number. The classified number is different. The classified number starts from the moment, about 60 years ago, when a small group of people in several different countries independently read the math on first contact probability and concluded, with the particular calm of people who spend their lives thinking about unpleasant possibilities, that meeting other civilizations in space might not be entirely friendly. Those people, some of them physicists, some of them military strategists, A few of them who existed in a professional category that doesn't really have a civilian name started working on a problem. The problem was, if we ever had to fight someone out there, what would actually matter? Not what we had, not what we could build in the near term, what would actually matter in a conflict fought across the scales of space. They worked on that question for 60 years, quietly, funding from a dozen different national sources, rooted through institutional categories that looked boring on budget spreadsheets. People who thought about terrible things so that hopefully the terrible things wouldn't happen, but if they did, they'd have something to show for the thinking. The verdant horizon was what they had to show for it. The conclave recessed for 2 hours after Okafor's statement. I know, because I was there, that the recess was not formally requested by the Velith or the Sanathi. It happened because Thessavar leaned over to their aid and said something quietly, and then the formal recess was announced, and then the most dignified and contained version of what the hell is a verdant horizon I've ever witnessed played out across the gallery of 67 civilizations. Ambassador Okafor used the recess to eat a sandwich. I'm serious, he had a sandwich packed. He sat in our gallery, ate half of it, offered me the other half, and reviewed some documents on his tablet. He looked like a man who had done something unremarkable and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. I ate the sandwich. It was good. Some kind of roasted vegetable thing with a sauce I couldn't identify, but that was excellent. Sir, I said because I had to say something, what is the verdant horizon? He looked at me. You'll see, he said. Which was infuriating. But also, and I only understood this later, exactly the right answer because there was no way to explain it. You could only see it. When the conclave reconvened, Thessavar addressed our gallery directly. Ambassador Okafor, the conclave would appreciate clarification. The verdant horizon is not registered in the galactic community's vessel database. No, Okafor agreed. It isn't. Can you tell us what it is? I can show you, he said, if the conclave is willing to accept a visual briefing. Thessavar looked at Seth-Korath, one of those looks that doesn't need translation because the meaning is in the brevity of it. Then they looked back. The floor is yours, Ambassador. Okafor nodded to our technical team. And then the main display, a holographic projection system in the center of the conclave hall, which had been showing tactical maps of the Vethara expanse, changed. What it showed was this. A ship. Except calling it a ship is the kind of reductive thing you say about something when you don't yet have the right words. Let me try again. Imagine you grew up on Earth. Imagine you know what mountains look like, real ones, not pictures. You've stood at the base of something enormous and looked up and felt small in a way that is simultaneously humbling and clarifying. You understand in your bones what big means. Now imagine that someone moved a mountain through space. Not a mountain-shaped thing. Not something that sort of evokes the scale of a mountain the way a large building might. An actual translation of that much mass, that much presence, moving, except articulated, purposeful, every surface of it designed. The verdant horizon was 4.2 kilometers long. For reference, the largest Velith warship in their current armada was 1.8 kilometers. The Sanathi capital-class vessels, the ones Seth-Korath had described as the backbone of the joint operation, were approximately 2.1 kilometers. The verdant horizon was 4.2 kilometers long, 1.8 kilometers at its widest point, and its forward profile looked like someone had taken the concept of a spearhead and then asked what would happen if you gave it 1,000 years to think about what it was. It was dark, not painted dark, in the way that things are when they absorb light rather than reflect it. The hull material wasn't something in the galactic community database. I found that out later. The hull composition was, apparently, one of the things that made several of the Dominari Collective's member units do the equivalent of sitting very still and paying very close attention. Along its flanks, in geometric arrays that the non-human eye required a moment to parse, weapons. Not the kind of weapons you put on a warship, because warships have weapons. The kind of weapons you put on a warship when you've spent 60 years thinking about what would actually matter. The main display showed it from 3 angles, forward, broadside, and aft, and then showed it to scale against the largest vessels in the proposed joint fleet. The gallery was quiet in a way I'd never experienced in any diplomatic setting. Not the polite quiet of listening, not the purposeful quiet of deliberation, something older than either of those, the quiet of reassessment. Of 67 civilizations, simultaneously realizing that they'd miscounted. "This is a prototype," Akaffer said, in the same even voice he'd used for everything else. "First in class, we call the class the Horizon series. First in class. Earth has developed this vessel over the course of approximately 6 decades, he continued. The technology is largely indigenous. We've incorporated some principles from exchange programs with community members, but the core design and capability is Earth origin. Indigenous. 60-year indigenous development producing something the community hadn't imagined humanity capable of. I'm going to ask our technical team to walk the conclave through the primary systems, Akaffer said. I'll translate myself for accuracy. A brief, very small smile. I've been briefed very thoroughly. What followed was 40 minutes that I can only describe by its effect, which was this. Seth Korath the Elder, who had not visibly reacted to anything in the previous 3 hours of proceedings, leaned forward approximately 6 centimeters and did not lean back. The Verdant Horizons drive system operated on a principle the galactic community database flagged as theoretical, pre-practical stage for most civilizations. Humanity had made it practical. The ship could achieve a displacement factor of 14.7, which in layman's terms meant it could cover distances that the Sanathi capital ships, with their best drives, covered in 6 hours in approximately 40 minutes. Its weapon systems included 4 primary rail projection cannons of a caliber that the Sanathi military analyst sitting 2 seats from Seth Korath apparently found so impractical they'd never seriously pursued, too much power requirement, too much engineering complexity. Earth had solved the power requirement problem. The engineering complexity had taken 30 years of iterative development. The Verdant Horizon also carried something that the technical team, perhaps intentionally, saved for last. A planetary denial system. I want to be precise about what this means because the phrase gets thrown around loosely. This wasn't a bombardment system. This wasn't a device for causing damage on a planetary surface. A planetary denial system, in the specific sense in which Earth's engineers had designed it, was a device for making a planet uninhabitable, for stripping away the conditions that made any biological or technological presence sustainable, across the entire surface simultaneously, in a controlled, reversible way. That last part matters, the reversible part. Because humanity, in 60 years of thinking about terrible possibilities, had also thought about what happened after the terrible things. And they decided that the ability to end a conflict shouldn't be confused with the desire to commit genocide. The planetary denial system could be set to temporary, weeks, months, years, whatever the situation required. A world made unlivable until whatever was living on it in a hostile capacity had to leave or negotiate. Or it could be set to permanent. The hope was to never use the permanent setting. The presentation ended. The conclave hall was quiet for a very long time. Thesivar broke the silence. Ambassador Akaffer. Their bioluminescent skin was doing something I'd never seen before, a complex shifting pattern I didn't have a reference for. I wrote down my best description of it and looked it up later. The closest translation, the recalibration of a foundational assumption. Yes, Chair Thesivar. You are saying that Earth has had this capability for some years. Yes. And you have chosen not to register this with the community. Akaffer paused just briefly. We chose to be cautious, he said. We're a young civilization. We were unsure how this would be received. He was being diplomatic. What he meant, what I understood him to mean, and what I think most people in that hall understood was, we weren't sure if knowledge of this capability would make us a target. 42 years old, one planet, a lot to lose, a lot of reasons to be careful. Seth Korath spoke. Their voice, in Sanathi, has a quality that the translation systems render as deep and measured, but which in the original language carries additional harmonics that indicate something like controlled intensity. The kind of voice that has spent a long time learning not to show everything it contains. Ambassador, they said, I have been a military strategist for this conclave for approximately 300 years. In that time, I have reviewed the capabilities of every registered military power in the community. A pause. I have not encountered anything like this. I understand, Okafor said. The question I would ask, Seth Korath continued, is not why Earth developed this. I think I understand why. Another pause. The question is, what do you intend to do with it? And here is the moment that I keep coming back to. The moment that lives in me differently than all the others. The moment I wrote about in every log entry and report and personal note for months afterward. Okafor said, we intend to use it to help. Just that. No caveats, no conditions. No if you acknowledge our standing or in exchange for formal security guarantees. Just, we intend to use it to help. The bioluminescence across Thesivar's skin shifted again. Something softer this time. Something I also didn't have a reference for, but which I wrote down and looked up later, and which translated approximately to unexpected sincerity. The formal deliberations lasted another 6 hours. I won't take you through all of it. Some of it was procedural. Some of it was the specific kind of diplomatic negotiation that requires a lot of precision, but doesn't make for very compelling storytelling. What I'll tell you is the broad shape of it. The Sanathi wanted technical specifications before agreeing to any joint deployment. Okafor agreed to share what was necessary for operational coordination. The Velith wanted clarification on the planetary denial system's legal status under community law, which was genuinely an open question because community law hadn't anticipated anything like it. That discussion took 2 hours by itself and ultimately resulted in an agreement to form a legal review body, which sounds very boring, but was actually significant because it meant the community was formally acknowledging that Earth's capability existed and needed to be integrated into the framework. The Dominari Collective was interested in the hull material, very interested. In the Dominari's particular distributed attention way, 3 separate members of Vessel of Considered Opinions Collective kept returning to questions about it. Okafor noted the interest and said that material science exchange was something Earth would be happy to discuss through appropriate channels. And at the end of it, at the end of 6 hours, the joint operation on the Vethara expanse was restructured. The Verdant Horizon would deploy as part of the fleet, not as support, not as observer capacity, as a primary tactical asset. Earth's delegation would have a seat at the operational planning table. Not the back corner, the table. I was packing up my translation equipment when Vessel of Considered Opinion appeared next to me. They moved quietly, the Dominari. Their distributed surface gave them a particular kind of spatial presence that was larger than their apparent body, because part of what you were perceiving was their extended field, their collective awareness taking in the room. You are pleased, they said. I considered denying it, but the Dominari are very good at reading biological stress indicators, and also, apparently, biological pleasure indicators. Yes, I said. You are surprised as well. That one I'll give you, I said. I knew we had something, I didn't know what. Vessel of Considered Opinion was quiet for a moment. Their surface moved in that slow-water way. We said that humanity was in its awkward phase, they said finally. I remembered. We may have been imprecise, they said. The phrase implies a phase that passes with time, with growth and aging. Another pause. What we observe today is not the awkward phase passing. It is the revelation that the awkward phase was never the whole picture. They turned, or oriented their primary interface toward me, which functioned as turning. Humanity developed in a direction we did not anticipate, because we did not look carefully. It wasn't an apology. The Dominari don't really do apologies in the way humans understand them. It was something more neutral and also more honest, an acknowledgement of a perceptual error, a statement that the model had been wrong and needed updating. We'll try to be less surprising in the future, I said. I would not, Vessel of Considered Opinion said, recommend that. And then they moved away, and I stood there in the gallery of the conclave hall, equipment half-packed, watching the representatives of 67 civilizations file out around me. And I thought about what it meant to be a species that everyone else thought they understood, and then turned out to be something else entirely. I thought about 42 years and 60 years, and what it means to quietly prepare for something terrible while loudly hoping it never comes. I thought about Ambassador Okafor eating half a sandwich and waiting for everyone to catch up. 3 days later, on the transit back to Way Station Meridian, I was in the observation lounge again. Same cup of brown regret coffee. Same stars outside. Seth Korath came and found me. I don't know how they knew where I was. Maybe they asked someone. Maybe in 300 years of strategic thinking you develop a sense for where the useful information is located in any given environment. They stood, settled, really. Sanathi don't exactly stand next to the viewport and looked out at the same stars I was looking at. "Your ambassador," they said. "He expected this reaction." "I think so," I said. He chose the timing carefully. The conclave, the emergency session, an audience of maximum relevance. Seth Korath's large head turned slightly toward me. Strategic. "He's good at his job." "He is," Seth Korath agreed. "I would have done it differently. I would have deployed the vessel first and let the display speak for itself." A brief pause. "But I understand the value of letting a room come to its own conclusions." I looked at them. "What conclusions did you come to?" Seth Korath considered the question with the particular deliberateness of someone who doesn't say things they don't mean. "That humanity is not what we thought," they said. "That 42 years of registered membership is not the relevant number, that the community made an error in assessing your development. A comfortable error, comfortable because it made the math simple, but an error." Their eyes, which were very large and amber-colored and gave the impression of perceiving depth beyond the visible, turned back toward the stars. "I do not like making errors. I like them less when they have strategic implications." "To be fair," I said, "we weren't sure what we had ourselves." "That," Seth Korath said, "I believe and I find it." They searched for the word, clarifying. "How so?" "A civilization that does not fully understand its own capabilities," they said slowly, "is one that has not yet been shaped by them. The weapon precedes the doctrine. The power precedes the politics." A pause. "This means Earth's character has not yet been determined by what it can do. You have not had time to become what your capability could make you." I thought about that for a long moment. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Seth Korath made a sound that the translation system rendered as a soft, neutral tone, but which I'd learned over the past few days was the Sanathi equivalent of a considered shrug. "That," they said, "depends entirely on what you choose." We docked back at Way Station Meridian 2 days later, and Ambassador Okafor called the full delegation together in our assigned conference room. He stood at the front of the room, still in his formal diplomatic coat, and he looked at us, 11 diplomats, 20 support staff, one junior liaison interpreter who had eaten half a sandwich, and listened to a military strategist who was 300 years old talk about character. "You should know," he said, "that the Verdant Horizon has already departed from its construction berth at the Titan shipyard." He paused. "It will rendezvous with the joint fleet in 12 days. Commander Adiz Nwachukwu is in command." He let that sit for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," he continued. "What happened in that hall was not a demonstration of strength. It was not a demand for respect. It was not, and I want to be very precise about this, an attempt to change our position in the community through intimidation." He looked around the room. "It was a statement of willingness. Earth built that ship because we were afraid, and we prepared anyway, and now we are telling our neighbors what we prepared, because there is something in the expanse that is larger than any of our individual concerns, and we would rather face it together than watch others face it and offer nothing." He looked down at his hands for a moment, something I'd never seen him do, that small private gesture, and then back up. "Some of you," he said, "have been doing this work for years and have felt the weight of how the community sees us, the patience in their voices, the careful accommodations." A pause. "I want you to understand something. That is going to change, not because of what we showed them today, because of what we do next. Because of whether we use what we have in the way we said we would." He straightened slightly. "The easy thing would have been to stay quiet, to keep the horizon classified, protect our advantage, let the other powers handle the expanse." He shook his head. "That's the kind of thinking that builds walls. We didn't come out here to build walls." Someone from the diplomatic team, Yukiya Samura, our trade specialist, said, "Sir, what happens now with the community?" Okafor allowed himself a small, genuine smile, not the diplomatic kind, the real kind. "Now," he said, "we do the work." I wrote my incident report that night. Standard format, all the technical language, time-stamped and filed through the appropriate channels. 17 pages of diplomatic record, precise and documented. Then I opened my personal log, the unofficial one, the one that was just mine, and I wrote something different. I wrote, I watched 67 civilizations look at us today and recalibrate. Not because we were loud, not because we demanded anything, because we had been quietly doing something for a very long time and today it came to light, and the light was different than anyone expected. And the part that stays with me, the part I keep turning over, is not the ship, not the weapon, not the moment in the hall when every species in that room went quiet. It's Seth Korath in the observation lounge, asking what we would choose to become. Because that's the question, isn't it? Not what you have, what you choose to do with it. We're 42 years old in a galaxy that has civilizations older than our species' evolutionary line. We're new and small, and we came to a room full of ancient powers and we said, we want to help. And somehow, against every reasonable prediction, they believed us. Or at least they decided to find out. I think that's the best any of us can hope for, to be given the chance to find out. The joint fleet departed for the Vethara expanse 11 days later. I wasn't on it. My role was back at Way Station Meridian, coordinating communication logistics between the fleet and the diplomatic channels. That was fine. That was where I could be useful. But I watched the departure from the observation deck. The Velith ships, beautiful and enormous, ancient and confident. The Sinathi capital vessels, bristling and purposeful, every line designed for function. The Dominari war collectives, that strange distributed presence that resolved, at a distance, into something shaped approximately like a fleet. And at the point of the formation, at the front, where traditionally the most senior command asset would position itself, the verdant horizon. Dark against the stars, absorbing light, 4.2 kilometers of 60 years of human stubbornness and preparation, and the particular refusal to believe that a problem was too large. It moved out of formation's staging area, and the drive engaged. And the stars around it did that thing, that subtle, wrong-looking thing that displaced field drives do, where the geometry of the immediate space shifts in a way that feels like an optical illusion, but isn't. And then it was gone, and the rest of the fleet followed. And I stood at the viewport with my terrible coffee, and I thought, 42 years. We are 42 years old, and we are at the point of the formation. Not because we demanded it. Because we earned it. The operation in the Vethara expanse lasted 63 days. I'll tell you about that later. There's more to this story, there's always more, and the expanse deserves its own accounting, its own careful telling, because what happened out there was not simple and not clean, and not the kind of story that ends with everything resolved and everyone going home satisfied. War, even the defensive kind, even the kind you're fighting because something in the dark won't stop taking your ships and your stations and your people, is not simple. But that's for another time. What I'll tell you now, what I think matters most, what I wrote down in my personal log and have carried with me since, is this. In the days after the fleet departed, I received a message through the diplomatic channels from Vessel of Considered Opinion. It was not formal, not official. Just a personal message, rooted through the standard Dominari communication protocol. It said, "We have revised our taxonomy. The awkward phase is a category for civilizations that have not yet decided what they are. It does not apply to species that already know. You have always known. We simply did not ask. I think about my grandmother sometimes when I think about all of this. She was born in a small town in what used to be the state of Jalisco. She grew up without reliable electricity, in a place where the hospital was 3 hours away, and the idea of space travel was something that happened to other people, Americans, Russians, Chinese, in the news. She lived long enough to watch the first contact broadcast, sat in her living room in her late 80s and watched the Dravari ship lower through the clouds over the North Sea, and said, "My mother told me this story many times," she said. "I knew it. I always knew we weren't alone. Not afraid, not overwhelmed, just I knew it." That confidence, that specific human confidence in the face of the enormous and the unknown, the refusal to be surprised for long, the immediate pivot to, and now what do we do? My grandmother never knew about the verdant horizon. She passed before I started this work, before any of this. I think she would have been deeply proud, not of the weapon, but of the choice, of the showing up. She used to say, the way you walk into a room tells people everything. Ambassador Okafor walked into a room of 67 civilizations. He walked in slowly, he ate a sandwich, he waited for his moment. And when his moment came, he said 3 words and sat back down. And the room changed. I'm writing this 2 years after the conclave. Things are different now, not completely different, not the way you'd want them to be if you were writing a satisfying story where everything resolves. Still some of the old patterns. Still some of the patience in the voices of civilizations that have been doing this much longer than us. But different. Earth has a permanent seat on the Joint Security Council now. 3 of the technical exchange programs that were theoretical 2 years ago are operational. The Verdant Horizon, which came back from the expanse with 3 of its weapons arrays requiring replacement, and a drive system that Commander Nwachukwu said performed like it was angry, is in refit at Titan. They're building the 2nd ship in the class, the Meridian Dawn. I've seen the preliminary specs. I've signed about 400 non-disclosure agreements related to them. I can't tell you much. What I can tell you is that it's bigger. Not because Earth wanted to be impressive, because Earth looked at what the Horizon had to do in the expanse and said, that wasn't enough, we need more, and then started solving the problem. That's the part that I don't think the community fully reckoned with at the conclave. The ship was the revelation. But the willingness to keep building, to assess what you have and decide it's not sufficient and start working on the next thing, that's the ongoing revelation. We don't stop. It's not a posture, it's not a strategy, it's just who we are. We look at something impossible and we say, and now what do we do? And then we figure it out. Last month, I was at a reception at Waystation Meridian, one of those things that is technically social, but is actually just diplomacy with better food. Thessevar was there. We ended up standing near the same section of viewport, both looking out at the traffic lanes, the ships coming and going, the whole machinery of the greater galactic community in motion. Thessevar's bioluminescence was doing the soft, relaxed pattern that indicates something like contentment, or at least the absence of immediate concern. Interpreter Vasquez Min, they said. Ambassador Thessevar. We looked at the ships for a moment. Your Ambassador Okafor, they said eventually. Is he well? He is, he sends his respects. He is a notable individual, Thessevar said. I have met many notable individuals in my career. He is notable in a particular way. How so? Thessevar considered the question for a moment. Their skin shifted through a couple of patterns, thinking patterns, deliberation, and then settled. Most individuals who carry significant power, they said, carry it visibly. It changes how they enter a room, how they address others. A pause. Ambassador Okafor entered our hall with the vessel power you have now revealed and the entire demonstrated history of human resilience behind him, and he ate a sandwich and waited his turn. Their bioluminescence shifted to something warm. That is a kind of power I find reassuring. I thought about that. I'll tell him you said so. Please do, Thessevar said. We stood at the viewport for a while longer, 2 people from very different evolutionary paths looking at the same stars. Outside, a human transport and a Velith science vessel were traveling the same lane in the same direction, about a kilometer apart. Going somewhere together. Not the same destination, probably, but the same direction for now. That felt like enough. That felt like a start.